Hello everyone, today we take into consideration certain ethical, juridical and religious aspects of low medieval warfare and also love medieval politics, telling the truth, because this is where everything starts from, as war is nothing but a mean um, of politics indeed. Um, so First of all, I would like to look at this kind of, especially the 14th century. This is a moment of great. We'll naturally cover also other parts of the of low medieval Europe at this point, but just sticking to this moment of crisis, of especially the universal institutions, which are naturally in Western Europe, the Empire and the Papacy. Because technically speaking, up to the 13th century, the idea of a universal empire was still feasible, or at least, especially the Holy Roman Empire had enough, or better, not even the Holy Roman Empire proper, but those dynasts who rose to this throne had before the first half, the second half of the 13th century, surely a great influence, a great political and military power indeed. Um, Whereas in later times, the main change occurred with the fragmentation of the political power, and even papal power that had been actually the one that had emerged kind of victorious from the struggle against against the empire after a certain time of hegemony that was over, especially from the Channel to the to up to Constantinople, basically starts to I mean, we're talking French-Anjevin Empire at this point, basically declined. And we can see this, we can interpret it in many ways. Indeed, there was a major structural systemical failure of of Europe towards the beginning of the 14th century that eventually was markedly evident, especially by this crack caused by the Black Death, but there had been already major symptoms of crisis, very deep crisis, and in this period, both the empire and the papacy practically shrink in power. They're still actually there. They're still effective in some way, because a lot naturally of emphasis is placed on how, I don't know, especially the Holy Roman Empire was never a really a national monarchy, for instance. I mean, it could have not been, or better, you could argue even the contrary, in the sense that the eventually the empire got, especially during the 14th century, got more Germanized. But this is also an approximation, because by certain standards, Germany had never been unified, and this is why I was practically telling it the way it was. I mean, not existing a national monarchy into Germany, the Holy Roman Empire as such, as the whole ensemble of populations that lived there, had always kind of suffered of this. After the end of the Swabians, of course, that few centralized power that existed into the empire kind of vanishes, or at least is reduced and reformulated on very different bases that naturally weaken it consistently. But at the same time, it's not that imperial authority or imperial administration really disappears, especially in Germany naturally. But the point is, we shouldn't naturally look at a complete collapse. The same goes a bit like for the papacy. The papacy, as we said before, was faring better because it still was enormously wealthy, enormously powerful, and enormously centralized. And it kind of began to stress at this point even further prerogatives in order to back this structural building of the church and all the administration system. It was figure about bureaucracy, etc., both in Avignon and in Rome afterwards. But let's say that there was a general crisis, because indeed these powers had increasingly we can't say secularized in practice, de facto. It's not maybe the best word, especially for the papacy, but not even for the empire, because the empire, the medieval empire, has not to be understood secularly, nor even up to which up to the Napoleon disbanded the Holy Roman Empire. That was still this universal symbol, at least in theory. However, what is important in this phase of the Middle Ages, and which naturally can be more or less extended, is, let's stay elastic. Already during the 13th century was a big debate about this. But it's the idea that the concept of Auctoritas was practically didn't how it had been up to that point did not correspond to the new political conditions of Europe at the time, because the Auctoritas is something that indeed, in Republican Rome, the Auctoritas, so the one that basically was eventually inherited by the medieval empire, which is arguably conceptually the same thing, at least in this abstract terminology. The Auctoritas was somehow, let's put it simple here, was I don't know, I may make a video on Auctoritas actually, but it was a sort of additional power to the one that was already conferred by law to the popular magistrates. So it basically the Auctoritas legitimated these institutions themselves, and this originally this authority derived from tradition. I mean, it was believed that also here in a typical Indo-European fashion, that is in this sense very much reinforced a little bit during the Middle Ages, that it was the freemen that, however, had, and in their tradition, their customary law in practice had the greatest importance. So even a sort of sacral nature. So naturally, during the Middle Ages, of course, then in Republican Rome, then eventually during the Empire, let's say that, because also the term Republic and Empire in periodizing meaning are an approximation, because technically the Roman Empire has always remained a republic, and the and it already had an empire before Augustus, indeed, even in the actual as the Imperium was practically conferred already to the consuls and other magistrates with military functions since a very early age. Excuse me, I drink a little. But at the time of from Augustus onwards, so towards this transformation to a monarchy de facto, in spite of the presence of the Senate, that was originally believed to own partly of these Auctoritas. This Auctoritas was shifted to the princeps, so to the prince, to someone who in fact had the imperium, and that was owning it by himself, through his own virtues, we can say, in relation with the divinity. That is also something I've been discussing pretty much, especially if you look at if you want to go, I know certain topics like this can be a bit foggy, especially when explained so quickly, but so if you have never heard about this, go look the video I've made, which is called The Roman Eagle, an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march, which perfectly expresses, in my opinion, the relation that the Romans had. So not with political power. There was not something secular and modern as we imagine it today, how we reinvented it during the Enlightenment, but it is interpreted actually in a very kind of ancien régime way. And we kind of stress instead the kind of the medieval nature of the ancien régime, because naturally in the medieval empire was not this big deal of authority and centralization as we have seen, but however the concept of the empire, of the imperium, was even in medieval times pretty much clearly conceived in the same fashion it was conceived in imperial time, in Roman times. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Christians and pagans, because actually the concept remains the same fundamentally. The concept of the imperium is something that is felt very deeply also into the Christian society, since ever since actually since the same Gospels. But eventually, naturally, especially with the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianism, that was integrated in more developed political theories, and de facto sanctioned, as the medievals were mostly looking, obviously, as Christians at the Constantinian Empire. So they naturally knew who Augustus had been, etc. But obviously, the perfect empire, the perfect Christian and Roman Empire, was the one of the time of Constantine. So this kind of golden age, ideally, that had sanctioned the marriage between the church and state, although pretty quarreling marriage eventually, especially during the Middle Ages. But this is not the point. It was just to give a bit of context. So up to this moment of the low Middle Ages, we can say that the idea of the empire had kind of been deeply felt, and I don't know how to say this, but the empire was objectively still there. I mean, as long as there were the Swabians, the Holy Roman Empire, or the German Empire as you want to call it, was indeed something that resembled, in potential at least, an ecumenical power. And there is really no doubt about this. If you see what before the Battle of Legnano, the influence of the Holy Roman Empires, of the German Empire, let's say of the Hohenstaufen power, actually stretched to, you realize they were at one step from and they actually also remained afterwards at one step from even conquering Constantinople, having a huge influence over the whole Mediterranean and Europe, and therefore reuniting West and East, ideally speaking. Well, when the Swabian dynasty extinguishes and this power practically collapses, there is an evident, there is a massive evidence, a macroscopical evidence, that Europe doesn't have an imperial power that can settle the major problems of Christianity, chiefly war, because the empire was believed first and foremost to ensure peace to the so-called Christiana Societas, so to the Christian society. So even bearing the sword, in this sense, was the unavoidable solution to curb the wicked, and to dispense justice practically. And at this point, this doesn't exist anymore. The major power in Europe is France, that is indeed has some imperial ambitions as well, as the French kings also began to formulate new kind of Caesaro-papistic political theories concerning their prerogatives, etc. But it's evident that also in the case of France, it's not a power that encompasses the whole of Europe, and there is still a struggle. And especially in the 14th century, even France begins to crack, as it gets engulfed into the 100 Years' War, all these massive defeats against the English, and in there it's pure chaos. Like the 14th century is felt in many ways as a moment of great crisis, of great disorientation. It resembles. There are other centuries in history that look like that. For instance, the 16th century or even the 10th century. I mean, it depends then, obviously, also in here for very different reasons, actually. But the 14th century is as if Europe didn't have a political balance anymore. I mean, it was fairly immune now to great to external threats, we can say, because the Mongols had, the Mongol Empire was crumbling. In Spain, the Moors had been kind of halted, and there was no way they could really do anything else. In the East, everything was extremely messed up. The Westerners, yeah, they had lost the Holy Land, but they were practically everywhere still, and the situation was extremely fragmented. The Ottomans were kind of rising, but nobody could expect in this century they would become like that, and that the ones of the following times, and that happened also partly much due to the behavior of the same Western powers that existed in there. I made a video about that. I don't remember which title it had, but it was. If you go into the medieval Islam playlist, you should find it. There is a map of the Ottomans growing, and that's my analysis of the thing. Which is disconcerting. It's kind of shocking by certain standards, because you realize that basically it was the Westerners that fabricated the Ottomans, not just that they let them practically eating bit by bit the Byzantine Empire, but it actually triggered the conditions for the Ottomans to rise in the first place. While they could perfectly be halted initially, especially initially, and up to relatively late in time, telling the truth. So, but this is another topic. During the 14th century, naturally European society is very developed, and as in every moment of crisis, actually, you see that there is a big deal of original thinking, because simply the bases, the premises you were used to think like were jumped. Where is the empire? Where is the papacy? How can these powers interact with each other? What kind of degree of coercion they can exercise on Christianity? And the idea of the crisis was pretty much in front of a lot of even cultured people who were, in fact, this is the moment in which humanism starts. So there is a big deal of resources dedicated into Europe to the development of new political ideas. And so, as I was saying, the immediate evidence is that this political fragmentation that was noticed in Europe at the time was not a full chaotic fragmentation. I mean, there was some order. I haven't discussed much this phase of history, but I have my own I'm very opinionated about this topic, because I like to stress the fact that there was a kind of order anyway, and that this order is the same that eventually was to survive into Europe, and from which the major powers also in modern age would emerge. At this time, everything is still to be settled, but there are already seeds of certain let's say areas kind of developing on their own. Especially if you take Germany and Italy, you see that these two areas that were, by the way, the ones that had traditionally mostly gravitated around respectively the imperial and the papal authority, are deeply fragmented indeed, but at the same time they're able to reconstruct certain political territories that would, albeit very slowly, progress to become something more consistent from a political point of view. So paradoxically, the decline of ecumenical powers didn't bring to pure chaos. but it still saw the rise of certain powers. Germany actually was much more messed up than because, but also in here you find that there are certain families, certain princely dynasties that, however, albeit with enormous difficulties, especially because they were feudal dynasties, so they lacked kind of centralization on their own, managed to shape some sort of regional power dimension. Forget about the Habsburgs, think about the Luxembourgs, other powers like the Wittelsbachs or the Wettin, and so on. In Italy, there is something you wouldn't expect. I mean, yeah, the empire has failed in part, and therefore these Italian city-states should like tear each other apart on their own. Well, this is what they do, but from this struggle, actually, much more solid territorial dominations emerge. And that's when the Italians switch from the communes to the lordships. Also here it's a bit of an approximation, but kind of start to build kind of regional states that are certainly something much more unitary than every single state going on its own way. So I like to stress how this moment of crisis even brought to solutions that were actually not so bad after all, but that entailed unavoidably something disconcerting for those times and places. That is the idea that there is not a ecumenical order anymore, that there is not a universal power anymore, and that entails the reconsideration of the world political theory in a measure or in another. So which material or moral control could really the empire or the papacy have on certain powers that de facto were sovereign on their own? And over which, by the way, I mean, states that had built over this sovereignty, this de facto sovereignty, basically the same sanction of, formal or informal sanction of their own legitimacy. Because still, by the way, these communities were framed within a hierarchy that already existed. And sometimes, especially now, the empire was sanctioning certain powers from a secular point of view, so to accept them, to frame them into the feudal hierarchy. Obviously, this was being done when you read Empire. You have to understand naturally the princely German princely family that had at that moment was holding the imperial crown. That was actually doing that just for be paid to deliver. I mean, to confer these titles within the feudal hierarchy. But this just for saying that this system still worked. I mean, the universal powers were weak, but still they were there. The problem now was how to ensure, especially from a practical point of view, the safeguard of the local rights that had been arguably, especially in the feudal empire, or how it had shaped mostly as a feudal thing during the centuries, how to ensure the defense, the pacification, the justice indeed. So, and this was extremely complicated also because the Latin vocabulary of, let's say, of the political theory was extremely, could be at least used in a very ambiguous ways. Think, for instance, about the terms res and causa. So the thing, the matter, say, and the cause. This could really be interpreted in the most, in something and their opposite. And these new political theories were really disconcerting also for the way they could wildly differ and create radically different approaches to the matters, etc. And by the way, bear in mind that this was happening still with a very poorly concealed hostility between the empire and the papacy that was going on still at this time. Maybe actually also in the second half of the 14th century this kind of grows to an end. Mm. Because especially with the decline of France, the let's say the situation had been much more fluidified. I mean, the weakening both of France and of Germany, the papacy really didn't have a bias more than much. I mean, he just supported who was the least dangerous for him at the moment. But this is also not this point. By the way, relatively to this problem of the the moral superiority, there is a beautiful passage from Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan was a French I don't know to say woman of letters. I think she's mostly famous for her poetry, but she actually wrote also about history and other very complex matters. She was actually an Italian-French woman. She came originally from Venice. Actually, she married a French nobleman, and she was a bit, in this sense, everything. She was she wrote poetry, but she was also a philosopher, and she is kind of probably the first professional female writer in European history, and also a very important thing. She dealt also especially with secular history as well. So she is Christine de Pizan is kind of the part of the result of the situation. It's a part of the expression of the political context we were talking about. So something very new that had never also seen before as attitude, as in terms of independent thought, etc. And she was extremely cultured, by the way, and she wrote contents that could range from the biographical to the religious to the mythological. And this was actually pretty normal at the time, because that was usually the kind of pool of topics that especially women were educated by. But Christine de Pizan went kind of beyond this, and she wrote famously a biography about Charles V of France in 1404, and she actually was in charge of the. And by the way, in this work, she's very precise, because she tells things she had seen herself, so as a direct witness of that historical event, or looking at historiographical sources and other bibliography, and so documenting herself. And she also managed a scriptorium, so that would be it's a place where you write, essentially. But this was organized, and in this scriptorium was also production of very prized illuminated manuscripts. She also wrote. She was important also for the conception of the woman at the time, because that at the time women were considered, scientifically, at least for what science was like at the time, inferior beings indeed. There is excruciatingly macroscopic evidence of all the misconceptions that existed at the time. And Christine actually wrote a very interesting. She wrote this work for the Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who was actually married to the French king. A work named "The City of the Dames," in which she made a list essentially of all the examples of virtuous and important women in the history of humanity. So if you ever have the chance to read Christine de Pizan, read it, because it's very it's very lets you really think a lot. And um, I quote this from her work, Livre des faits d'armes et des chevaleries. So this would be the book of the military enterprises kind of, and of chivalry. And so I'm paraphrasing a little in here. So these were often written in dialogue. These works were written in dialogical form, and there was a question that was posed in the book, when how it is not licit, if not to kings and sovereigns, to basically take the lead in by their own authority to into wars and to battles with someone. So the author answered that basically the right, this very right of going to war and to battle as a leader, so deciding also to whether wars and battles had to be fought, only pertained to the emperors, the dukes, the kings, and other seigneurial, say, other territorial lords that at that time are at the same time owners of say secular jurisdictions, temporal jurisdictions, let's say better. Those who cannot wage war, essentially, are the barons of every kind, and the other lords. It doesn't matter how powerful they are, except if they are licensed for this, and they have the allowance and the authorization from their own sovereign. So essentially, here Christine was advocating for the that everybody who had a juridical was owning a juridical authority, a right of sort over a certain territory, a certain community, was basically so a power was essentially sanctioned by the authority, the hierarchy, by the emperor, by the sovereign, etc., could really take that initiative. The other minor powers, so those who basically were people of great status, but weren't conferred with any jurisdiction, essentially couldn't take this this initiative unless they were allowed from by their sovereigns. This is a kind of sometimes it's funny to think also at the naivety and the innocence of such interpretations, because it's a bit all like that. I mean, these are actually these statements are very important. They're not simple. They're not something you give for granted. To be written down in the first place, especially by a woman at the time. And they're very important because they are stressing the legitimacy, how you want to call it, of the political hierarchy as it was known at the time. So actually stressing the legality besides the legitimacy of the authority. This naturally was a sort of conservative view, because other powers were essentially, actually, in the hierarchy, everybody was kind of saying the same thing, but always from their own perspective. Like every power said, okay, basically whoever is more powerful than me is I recognize his authority in some measure, but I also want to stress my own prerogatives as as a as a political entity. I was born to, in the first place, to be autonomous and to mind about the rights of this community. And at the same time, he said all those who come under me, were less powerful, etc., should obey to me, because even if they may have some sort of definitely of right and of autonomy in their administration and politics, I'm still the major power. So I was sanctioned in this position by God, and I have a sort of authority that goes beyond even the same. So there were lots of double standards, and naturally at the highest echelons of society, like especially Christine was kind of writing for. It's obvious that, I don't know, the King of France would have definitely appreciated to stress the importance of the feudal hierarchy all over his vassals, indeed, but in this, there were very vague terms. Think about, in this sense, the relation between France and the Empire. France at this time was much more powerful than the Empire, and would had to obey to, because France had already developed a kind of pretty autonomous-minded perception of what matters have to be settled in practice. So that and it was very convenient to do this, also from a Christian perspective, because a sort of a moral fitness was obviously required, but for Christian standards, but the same existence of one power in was seen as a sort of proof that God had wanted that power to exist and to operate in the first place, in spite of all, in spite even of the evil that was committed. So it was very, very easy to flip this, and you can argue that there was a sort of dichotomy that always worked more or less in the same way. Naturally, this was backed even very complexly, very thoroughly, with many examples, with many. You have to think that there was a huge debate also in juridical terms, like the Roman law at this time was pretty much beginning to crystallize after its recovery in the previous centuries into the West, and at the same time there were also other major several interpretation of the whole Roman law system that indeed could also get quite political, because it being an extremely complex system, you could assume certain certain concepts that could be, and also this semantics in here was much debated, as we were saying before, with switching meaning to names like res and causa was something extremely convenient to do according to your own interests. Always given, however, as we were saying before, that the empire and the papacy were still recognized as sovereign authorities in their own respective fields. Also, there was a big debate, naturally, as we were reminding about, where one began and the other finished, and actually they both tended to overlap really with each other prerogatives. But at the same time, nobody in Europe at the time said, okay, the emperor does not exist, the papacy does not exist, I do what I like. They were mostly instead stressing the validity of their own power, basically on the basis of their own existence at the end of the story, and naturally backing it with many other ideological constructions, let's say, but mostly sticking to that. And this is important also because this system was essentially the result of something that had developed also very dynamically in the previous centuries. I mean, even if you look at the very origins, think about the empire in the West in the times of Charlemagne. That's something, would it really give the validity to the imperial appointment of Charlemagne to the papacy? Because that is from the Roman law that it's illegal, and that's why, for instance, the Byzantines didn't recognize their Western counterparts, because objectively there was no actual right. But that's, however, that there is a much deeper interpretation sometimes because I kind of stick to the legalist perspective of Constantinople. But at the same time, it's not a matter of who was right, who was wrong. We have to understand why certain concept had emerged in the first place, and you can look at the Western Empire actually as something much less awkward than it may seem, because after all, the Imperium, both by Christian and Arian standards, was indeed something that came straight from the divinity. So even the legalism was considered mostly as a sort of cavil at that point, not to recognize the fact that indeed, certain powers in the West had risen to and Christian powers plus to a huge power that could not be seen in those times differently, but from legitimized by God. So, however, it's remarkable how this feudal system was still recognized in the essentials pretty standardly into the West, in spite of all this excruciating political fragmentation. So there is also another there were certain things, certain moral problems implied, although there was a general recognition that also the church had certain prerogatives in terms of military affairs. So here the Imperium was arguably something, sometimes it was twisted a little bit in the way it was interpreted. There was a general interpretation at this time was given by Guillaume Durand. Maybe we talk about this figure a little bit. Excuse me, I drink a little. Guillaume Durand was a very important author of the 13th century. He was bishop. He was born in Pizan, close to Montpellier, in the around 1230, and he was a jurist and a treatiser. Essentially, he was mostly famous, especially for being the bishop of Mende and Languedoc in between 1285 to 1296. So he was a French, an Occitan actually, and he from 1255, as many law students, actually the best law students in Europe, he went to Italy when he to study right, and in fact he rose into the university career, and he taught both in Bologna and Modena. So he had a huge juridical knowledge, and in 1262 he was called into the Roman Curia, where he covered the offices of apostolic chaplain and of general auditor, let's say, of the Holy Palace, and in this sense he also participated to very important occasions such as the Council of Lyon in 1274. So he basically became a man of the church. And at this time, the importance of these jurists was extremely high, and the Roman Church was really having the best human resources at the time in terms of juridical expertise, bureaucracy, etc. And he under Nicholas III, Guillaume obtained the decanate of the capitulum of Chartres, and he in 1278 he even had this very important office of papal legatus in the territories of the patrimony of Saint Peter. So basically, of the region of Rome. So it was an extremely prestigious role, and naturally Guillaume, a very powerful man. At this time, there were lots of Frenchmen into the papal administration because of that bond that existed between Rome and the papal Angevin empire. A lot of Frenchmen, a lot of French popes also as well, and eventually, after a few decades, the popes also switched their residence to Avignon from Italy to southern France. So he also operated into the marshes and in Romagna, and these were very troublesome areas because formerly they belonged to the papal power, especially after these years of the 70s because before the empire had retained had retained control of those areas, especially the Romagna, etc. Instead, from Rudolf of Augsburg onwards, there was kind of the recognition that those lands were now formally into the papal church, into the papal states as by right, and Rome had always looked at those territories, and these were, however, very troublesome areas, also pretty mountainous areas. There were mountains in the middle better, and there were a lot of Ghibelline families that absolutely didn't want to give up their power to the papacy in the area. So there was a lot of warfare going on in there, and that's what the papal armies fought extensively against this resistance. So the problem there was to kind of legitimize the use of force from the church. There is a work from Guillaume that is the Speculum Juris, so would be literally the mirror of law, of right, that he wrote, and I quote from this. He says a clergyman can be put at the lead of a right war, not, however, to command directly to men of war. In practice, it would be men of war, actually, of blood. Sorry, but to respond to the soldiers, to provide money, to respect the treatises, to pronounce the sentences, to essentially dispose of everything, as we have done ourselves into the war that the Church of Rome has sustained in Romagna against the rebel cities. This is from, in fact, this was actually the quote of the Speculum Juris. So this is very, very important, because I actually also came across in just a few time afterwards to certain ways the papal legatus dealt with the administration of the papal army. So why was Guillaume writing something like this? Well, obviously he wanted to stress naturally the legitimacy of having a clergyman at the command of an army. This was pretty normal, telling the truth. It's not something we should be surprised by, because it's something very ancient, although a bit unorthodox. And it is something that pertains chiefly to Western Europe, or at least to non-Byzantine or Orthodox influenced Europe. Because for the Byzantines, this, for instance, would have been absurd. The the same concept of having of shedding blood was something negative, naturally in the whole Christian society, not just in the Western one. The it's not just in the Eastern one, sorry. So I made a video once that was talking essentially about the penitents that had to if you wait a second, I can find it. Bloodshed and penitence, I think it should be bloodshed and penitence in early medieval Europe. That kind of deals with the problem. But however, in Western Europe, the customs were a bit more lax in this sense, because war by certain standards was kind of endemic at all times in Western European history, at least in the very tissue of society. You know, the Byzantine Empire was also pretty much troubled, but it was arguably a more, it was a stronger central authority, so by a certain sense it was more pacified. War was something that in Western Europe remained essentially as an habitual activity into society. It wasn't really something that people were marveled more than much by. Naturally, it was criticized. It was it was perceived as something evil, but it was also Christian customs kind of adapted to it in certain ways. Indeed, there were armed clergymen at all times in medieval Europe. This particular thing that Guillaume is writing about, however, is quite interesting because it reminds me it reminds me about the Carolingian Empire. In the Carolingian Empire, bishops and abbots were as feudatories of the empire, perceived as that they had the duty of basically bringing a certain amount of troops to the campaign. There are certain Frankish laws that Carolingian laws, especially, that let's say better, that issue this. The idea is that these individuals were responsible for that military contingent to arrive to the war zone, to the area of combat. And therefore certain laws explicitly said that the bishop and the abbot, just like any other let's see here, feudatory, let's say, any other lord of kind, just like a secular ones, had to lead his men up to the battle. Here the distinction actually between the clergyman and the layman occurred because the clergyman was not demanded to take part to the fight. He could bring his troops in there and coming back to his diocese or abbey, whereas the lay commander was naturally also in charge of combat proper. Nevertheless, we know perfectly that certain Carolingian abbots and bishops fought. This was actually normal also in pre-Carolingian times, as the ecclesiastical aristocracies were perfectly homogeneous. Was the same thing with the secular aristocracy. They were coming from the same families, and there are many authors that are even that of bishop warriors that wrote history and also in very Christian terms, etc., and that fought and I don't know were killed in battles at the time, against the Vikings and so on. And they were also part of the Carolingian family in some times. So this custom actually remained unvaried in most of Europe. There were surely areas where this was more practiced. Seemingly Germany was a place where bishops had this kind of more warlike attitude, but as we will see today, it was present everywhere, actually, in France, in England, in Italy, in many different ways, depending on also on the roles of these clergymen. But it was still feasible, and so the Westerners didn't really care much about this, because there was a kind of warlike ethos that had made such customs really always surviving without excessive moral problems. But not because these, people thought, I don't know, there is it's forbidden, but I do it the same, but because really the approach to the same rules was different, and it was seen still as something negative, but at some point also kind of a renounceable, kind of also a matter of responsibility. And this is explained in practice if you consider that these bishops were territorial lords like anybody else. The Abbey of Fulda at one time was meant into Germany was meant to be able to fill 20,000 men, and that was a sort of private army. It was normal in many ways. But this thing of leading, what Guillaume is writing here in the 13th century, is this idea that however, there is some moral problem to that, naturally, and since this guy was writing for the papacy, so therefore to the spring of the also the ecclesiastical law and to the most to the most important model of Christian conduct, there had to be some justification to that, because the popes had armies at this time like anyone else, any other lord at the time, and these figures, like the same Guillaume, by the way, who had been in charge of also these military affairs, had as legates of the church, were often in command of armies, and the point was just stressing the administrative function of the legate in this sense. So the legate is not really at this point conceived as a commander, although he could definitely be in practice, as a military leader, but he was just accompanying the army of the church, who, by the way, was considered naturally a crusader army. There weren't crusade armies just when there were crusades into the Holy Land. Basically, at so many levels, it was enough also in here to receive a sort of blessing to be conceived a crusade army, or at least even if you didn't have formal sanction from a pope, for instance, or from a bishop. You could just wear the cross and say, okay, we're fighting for God. We are crying from the good side, and it would be extremely interesting, likely to observe this case by case, because I can think of certain battles that I studied also pretty in detail, to which this was not true from both sides. So what was really the perception also of those who fought against the church, because some of them were, all of them arguably were equally considering themselves good Christians as much as those who were from the, let's say, pro-papal side, let's put it in this way. But there were also different political perceptions, different political standards, different political reasons for fighting. And so what I find very interesting, first of all, of Guillaume, is that he he is practically legitimizing the presence of a clergyman at the head of an army to deal mostly with these administrative functions, and backing this with a practical example, that is the one of the same Guillaume when he was at war as a papal legate against the Ghibelline powers of Romagna. So a war that, by the way, had been pretty harsh and pretty famous at the time into Europe, and that had necessarily involved these these figures like Guillaume, who, by the way, was not raised as a military man. He was raised as a man of law, as a man of culture, of education. In fact, what really strikes you is somehow how certain civil administrators turn out to be also extremely efficient military commanders, because it's not automatic, really. It's not so obvious as you might think, but also in terms of in administrative terms, it's very important to be educated, especially at the time, where it was a rare eventuality. So these were men that could really perform so many tasks, and naturally there were delegates who had more, military ability or expertise, and those who instead were there just. And in fact, usually, what we have to think is these papal armies were, however, made up not by papal soldiers. At the time, the war was the market of war was pretty much dynamic. These were all mercenaries, or at least there were helps sent by certain local cities or lordships that were faithful to the papacy. Like in the case of the war in Romagna, there were naturally as Guelphs as Ghibellines in there. So there were always someone who was. This is really an interesting thing of of medieval Europe. There is always someone that has some good reason for siding with you, and it's a pretty standard situation. So you're always gonna find someone who has to earn something to fight against your own enemy, everywhere, and vice versa. So someone that has got to fight against you. So. Within these troops were naturally normal. These papal armies were made up by like just any other army at the time. So there were commanders, mercenary captains, other military officials sent from certain cities, etc. So all people who knew the business of war, naturally. So not necessarily legate, in fact, had to be a warrior in itself. He could just stand there and delegate the actual military command to someone else. But it was still important for the list of things that concern really the administration of warfare, how this army was fed, how it was administered, how discipline was maintained, how the pays were delivered. And this naturally entailed a huge administration that was attached to the army. Think about the civil functionaries that were needed to make an army work, aside from the strictly military things. So here the list is very important here. So Guillaume is justifying himself, saying here this guy is not put at the command of the army to say, okay, just go kill people, because that's something that a Christian should never ask, although war is still necessary. But that's not the point of what the clergyman has to do. So this has naturally was stressing the old debated thing of the fitness of the clergyman. The idea of the clergyman had to be, because the clergyman in origin was not someone so different from the rest of the community. I mean, he's still a human being. It's mostly the office and the sacraments that are kind of impersonal in here. And there had been a huge debate relatively to the validity of the sacraments. For instance, if these were delivered, were how do you say, given by a morally unfit clergyman. also physically unfit, because for instance the contact with blood was seen as something seriously wrong at the time. So the clergyman had to remain pure, albeit staying here at the command of an army, had still to be detached, ideally, in theory, as a justification for his own office in that specific context from the strictly military business. So here Guillaume is saying, okay, the legate just administrates the army. Then the warriors, the fighters, the knights, the professional soldiers do their own business. They shed blood, other Christians' blood, although remember, everyone that takes arms against the papal army is unavoidably, not he's an heretic substantially. At least it's someone who is excommunicated, is enemy of the church. So there is this kind of extra moral legitimacy, of the for this bloodshed. But still, the clergyman had to remain pure from this point of view. So here it says he has to respond to the soldiers, for instance, as his tasks. So having I don't know here what it really means, but I assume it's just having a dialogue with the army, because it's kind of obvious, not just probably from a strictly religious point of view, but definitely also for steering their morale and having being trusted, because as we've seen, these were de facto military commanders, so there is some trust you have to put into your leaders. Doesn't matter if it's a clergyman or a layman. To provide for money, this was an extraordinarily important thing. The armies at this time needed to be paid. The second half of the 13th century is this moment in which everything kind of gets finally monetized. There's a lot of financial movements involved. We are not in time in which the money, the coin circulation was something rare. War was at this time increasing, also in size, in expenses. Think about the cavalry, how increasingly expensive and more professional it was transforming. So we're in the passage from the ideal feudal form of recruitment to mercenarism. So money have to be readily available. This legate had a treasure together with him to pay the soldiers, also because this was there were lots of bands that were hired along the way. It was full of mercenaries everywhere, and if you needed them, you needed the soldiers to be paid, because they were fighting for, if you had money in there. So sending from Rome all this money into the headquarters of the church in Romagna during the military campaign was definitely a way also to gather lots of people around that, because a lot of soldiers would want to be paid by this readily available sum of money. It's not something so it's something very material, very pragmatic in many ways. Then the other thing here is to respect the treatises. So the idea is also in here. It was a sort of legitimacy deriving from here probably the idea of the treatises has to do mostly with the political negotiations, I believe, during these wars. There was arguably as much political bargaining at this point than the military action, if not more. It was a continuous given the political fragmentation, there was also a continuous dialogue with so many smaller political entities, like cities, like lords, that all could be bought or in some way, or the balance was pretty unstable. There had to be a continuous dialogue. So the legate was, in this sense, an eminently political figure that had to also to deal pretty autonomously with this new eventual, the new the changing the changes that could happen during the campaign. Excuse me. In terms of I drink a little bit more. I mean, in terms of alliances, of negotiations, as we've said. And then there is another very important task in here that I came across several times in my, specifically in what I study. That is the pronouncing the sentences within the army, because this was something that happened. There was a discipline. There was a military discipline, a rule, a conduct, and these were things were taken really very, very seriously, and they required a central authority that judged in these matters. So there were naturally, and then it says it to dispose of everything. There were actually many other things attached to this. Also because the army was a way to make a lot of money from it. I was just reading something about the 20s of the 14th century of a papal army into northern Italy that was about which we know essentially how they this legate, as an individual, by the way, not as a legate proper, made a lot of money through things like, for instance, all the animals that were butchered into the army. You have to think these armies were extremely large sometimes. The papal legates had some of the largest armies. We're talking about tens of thousands. And think of all the people who lived within the army, all the civilians, all the merchants, all the prostitutes, and these there were lots of animals following. Also, there were stolen during the ravaging of the country, etc. So these were pretty. There was also pretty systemic way of war at this point in terms of ravaging, of absorbing. These armies, doesn't matter if they were papal armies or someone else's, to take the to exploit the campaign, to pillage everything, even into the enemy, even into the territories of the same friends, because it wasn't much about who cared about these guys. The whole thing was the broader chessboard, to destroy the enemy, but at the same time you had to profit a bit from war as well. You couldn't just keep this army without doing anything and thinking that it wouldn't pillage and so on. This was done systematically, and there were lots of revenues from this. For instance, in the case of the butchered animals, there were evidently also these cattle that was stolen, etc. The legate had, by law, by right, the privilege of having always a certain part of the meat of the slain animal, and to dispose of that freely. So either to consume it or to sell it in turn. So always was a toll on it, essentially, for butchering an army. Butchering an animal within the army. The prostitutes. The prostitutes in the papal army, interestingly enough, because the papal soldiers are not different from any other soldier, the prostitutes had to pay. And the interest, I don't remember, and not a few, also because there were lots of prostitutes. The sources add, there were like thousands. So they made the legate made a freaking lot of money just through this, and the excuse, just to make you understand how even the criticism and the legitimacy worked at the time. Why how we're talking about a crusader army? Why there had to be prostitutes in there? Wasn't it seen as morally unfit? And the idea of the church was, of course it was, and that's why we taxed that. Because there is also this concept into the Middle Ages of the concept of the interest, of the idea of producing value from speculating. And the official position of the church was that creating the rates of interest were something immoral. It was the Christians couldn't do it. This is the reason why, for instance, the Jews were relegated to financing financial activities, because it was believed that those, by being condemned to hell as non-believers, they could do this forbidden activity. The Christians bypassed, especially in this moment where they also began to this credit activity, money lending, money exchanging, etc. That the rate of interest was nothing but the payment for the expenses of the work that the businessman had to carry out. So not really speculating, so not really creating a fake, say, value from nothing, because the church deemed that as demoniac, as completely immoral and diabolic. But just saying, okay, I've kept your money, so since it costed me a lot, and you're just gonna pay me for that, okay? But it's not a speculation, and that's how banking was spread into Europe at this time, into Christian Europe officially. Like, the rate of interest is not an additional revenue you have from that money. It's just to cover the expenses of your own, of keeping in charge of the money. So Guillaume Durand in here was stressing essentially the authority that the papal legate had on the army, or the administration of the army broadly meant. And you can understand the interests that were beyond this. And this was being backed by saying, look, we're not doing this because we're bloodthirsty or because we like killing our Christians. This is something wrong. We need the legate in charge of an army because he had to take care of the administration from a purely civil point of view. It was a way to justify it in front of the bigger thing of having clergymen in charge of the army command. So indeed at the time there was this kind of prudency and also marvel and kind of surprise or indignation indeed towards the figure of clergymen or of monks that were dressed as and equipped as men of arms, essentially. And this was really felt into Christianity, because before we stressed a bit how in the West people didn't really care, but this is what I've tried to say as well before. It's not really that it wasn't really felt, but it still existed. And there is a big deal of difference between something that is tolerated because however it's considered wrong and something that really nobody cares about. So the good Christians reading the scriptures said, okay, especially the clergymen shouldn't, no Christian should really kill another human being, because that's however you want to say it, unless it's not a very and that's where the political theory also started to speculate on. But however, killing is a sin, so especially a clergyman shouldn't do that. But there were many situations in which this was kind of we can deem necessary, or at least when people didn't really look at the formalities. For instance, in 1360 there is this episode of of the raid of Winchelsea in the south of England. That is this quite picturesque town, actually. At the time was basically in that year was ravaged by 2,000 French troops. So this the sack of Winchelsea was conceived as a very ferocious affair, indeed. This was you can argue that these were the standards of medieval times, although this is not completely true. I mean, even in the Middle Ages, that naturally saw a lot of violence and fierce behaviors, brutality, and etc. Still, the massacre of the civilian population, like in this case, was seen as something really unusual, or at least that didn't happen very frequently, and was definitely stigmatized as a negative thing of exceptional brutality. And in the sack of Winchelsea, the French really slaughtered men, children, women, so everybody. And they were actually this very big force of 2,000, and the local Winchelsea had, by the way, been already wiped out by the plague some time before, so it wasn't really a florid and well organized time in that very moment, so they couldn't put up a resistance against the French. But there was famously this the abbot of Battle, who joined together with other priests and regulars in the counterattack against the French. So seemingly they were able to put up certain cavalry to call defenders from other surrounding towns, and to kind of put up this counterattack against the enemy. So the interesting thing is that the French basically went away at that point. And however, this hadn't really saved Winchelsea from devastation. But it's still interesting because this was something that was noticed by the chronicles, how the local abbot with other priests had taken arms and had essentially fought against to repel the attackers. So there were other examples of this that also entailed the role of certain clergymen, especially the clergymen of certain fixed dioceses, etc., that had ideally a military role. We have seen how the Germans, especially the German bishops, were renowned for such. There was Richard of Cornwall, was king of the Romans in Germany, was elected, was one of those weak sovereigns that followed, that just ruled by name after the fall of the Swabians, who was incidentally brother to Henry III of England. And we have certain letters, and one of that he exchanged with his brother, and in one of them it's Richard is essentially saying, oh, look at here in Germany, there are such warlike bishops. They have armies, they have their own regiments, they lead armies, they fight, and if this would be to great profit actually for the same England. And this is interesting because by the way, here in the episode, in the 1360 episode of Winchelsea, this was kind of 1 century before, to It was like in the 60s, in fact, of the 13th century. This letter between Richard and Henry III, and or even before, I don't remember. Um, but it's interesting to see that this actually happened somewhere else. Hmm? Now that I think, we spoke about Guillaume of Durand in these wars in Italy between the Guelph and the Ghibellines. Well, there are examples, for instance, the Battle of Campaldino, of bishops that were fighting into the Ghibelline army. By the way, even died in there. So it was present, and one of the most fascinating cases is the one of France. I mean, to see how the military role of certain bishops was kind of canonized, we can say, approximately into France. For instance, the Bishop of Beauvais and the Archbishop of Rheims had indeed certain spiritual dignities that, however, brought even to a great political prestige, at the point of making them participate to military operation, because you have to think it also from a moral point of view, sorry, the idea of having a holy man, allegedly holy man, into the army with you, like the Archbishop of Rheims, or the one of Beauvais. For instance, a bishop talking about there are examples of, for instance, by the way, these archdioceses sometimes were involved into war proper. For instance, the famous Battle of Azincourt, 1415, was fought a few miles north of Beauvais, for instance. So these were lands that belonged also to the bishops, in part, or at least that were felt as these bishops were definitely feudal lords on their own. If you take the Diocese of Beauvais, you see that the Bishop Roger II, for instance, died during the First Crusade, to which it had participated. Philip of Dreux, who was also a French nobleman and Bishop of Beauvais, he participated to the Third Crusade and to the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. Pierre Cochon was also Bishop of Beauvais in the 20s of the early 30s of the 15th century, and he was also the one who judged the trial of Jeanne d'Arc. So Beauvais was a very wealthy diocese. It had a pretty big importance into the French kingdom. So these figures were kind of felt as the certain kind of I don't know how to say that, unavoidable kind of fears into the institutional order of the French kingdom, so that you couldn't consider really the French kingdom also in its military might without the retinues, if not the true armies at this point of such powerful bishops. And think also all the national pride attached to certain spiritual figures. For instance, if you take the Archbishop of Rheims, that's arguably the most important one of all France, as the Cathedral of Rheims was the one into which Clovis had been baptized, for instance, and the same one into which Hugues Capet, so the head of the Capetian dynasty, was crowned in 988 by the Archbishop Adalberon on Christmas Day. So this these were, by the way, the French crown was to be considered as a vassal of the Church of Saint Denis. This is of the Abbey of Saint Denis, for instance. So, especially in France, there was this extremely strong bond between the crown and these dioceses that existed, especially around the Ile-de-France or in other areas like Picardy, that were like making the bulk of the French of the power of French crown proper. And they were, by the way, extremely fertile grants. They were the places were the same in origin. The same Frankish and Carolingian powers had developed feudalism as such, because they were such fertile lands, and they already belonged since late antique times to these ecclesiastical aristocracies, that everything was organized in a fashion into which such lords, doesn't matter whether ecclesiastical or lay, were capable of providing enormous retinues and to have an enormous individual power. So the Archbishop of Reims or of Beauvais or the Bishop of Beauvais weren't considered just as clergymen, but also as feudal lords, with all that this entailed from a military point of view. And we've seen it. They fought. Philip of Dreux was an eminent figure. He fought into the melee, into the battle of Bouvines proper. So these were men of war that naturally came from families of feudal lords on their own. So it was even difficult to detach these people from their family origin. I mean, if you were born into a family of feudal lords that were all knights, and you were destined to the ecclesiastical career, well, it doesn't mean that you all, especially in places like France, with this huge aristocratic emphasis, etc. You surely didn't become, I don't know, a pious man devoid of any, from. I mean, I'm sure these were pious men by certain standards, indeed. But even if, when we look at certain details, we realize that probably they still had, they were very material men, also very pragmatic in many ways, which is not necessarily a negative thing. I mean, this is the idea is that retained a quite strong aristocratic ethics in many ways that entailed a warrior mindset at the same time. So it's obvious that a bishop would lead those military retinue on the battle, and even to fight together with them, because it was normal. It was part of being part. It was a matter of being part of a certain family, of serving the crown at fullest, at showing their own political faith. And it's something that really went beyond, and it also had this markedly cultural thing that for the feudal aristocracy, it doesn't matter whether ecclesiastical or secular, the war was a daily business, and it couldn't be differently. It was not a matter of choice. It was not a matter of saying, oh well, but these guys were so evil and corrupted. This is an abstract judgment you can give in absolute theory. If you had looked at how their society was, you understand it was unescapable. So these weren't necessarily bloodthirsty people who enjoyed killing. These were simply people who had to maintain a certain name, a certain reputation, and also to in this sense, to really reinforce and fuel the feelings of belonging, and think about how Christianity, in this sense, was conceived as a value in solving the matters, because battles in the Middle Ages were not won by men; they were won by God. So it was, let's say, the holiest side that prevailed over the other, because naturally, from the individual perspective, if one person was right, the other had to be wrong, naturally. so this was also perceived as a justification. Even taking arms against an army of the church was, as we said before, a very serious matter, also for the consequences that this could happen with excommunication and so on. And there is, I think, a very important difference between the secular and ecclesiastical powers at this point, because they had essentially the same, as we've seen, the same goals. They were the same thing. They were lords, just like all the others. The papacy was a lordship like every other, but not really like every other in terms of administration, for instance, of political goals. I mean, there were differences, aside from strictly military phase that was exactly the same. And it had to do with the role, indeed, that the church had, the peculiar role it had when compared with the secular one that had to respond to the emperor, in theory. And this role entailed the idea that the church formally was not to provide. I mean, the church was interested in secular power, obviously, as that's why we've seen it, for instance, with the Romagna region. The papal states were expanding. They were necessarily governing. There was all a form of a very complex government. There were very pragmatic problems, very material problems that had to be resolved accordingly. We've seen it before also with the administration of the army. Armies function in the same exact way. It doesn't matter if it's a clergyman commanding them or a secular or a layman. But the idea was the church theoretically wasn't there in the world to rule over it just like secular powers, in the sense that the emperor was the one who had to ensure justice and all. And even though the papacy had naturally strived to impose a direct power over the emperor by stressing the superiority of this of the spiritual authority of the Church of Rome over the imperial power, they were also clever enough to say, okay, but we don't have nothing to do with the administration of Christianity. We just sanction what is right and what is wrong, but we don't have to deal with the administration. So while the other secular powers, like in fact the empire, the other kingdoms, and all the various lordships that existed, were striving to find, in the sense, a quite more statal-like justification for their power. They were simply saying, okay, we are here because we are put here by God, and so since we exist, that's the point. No, there had to be an effectiveness of their rule in order to receive legitimacy back. They couldn't say, okay, well, we're just here, we don't do nothing, because in the feudal perspective, the seigneurial power was legitimized exclusively by the in its efficiency in defending the local communities. So if this lord was not able to achieve that, to accomplish that, these communities could freely, in a very contractual way, seek the protection of someone else, and therefore to delegitimize the power. So the main problem of the secular powers at this time was really saying, okay, we have to make the thing work, and this is a moment of, in fact, great development also of the this time especially the prerogatives of the national monarchies, but they were already oriented towards a statal model, essentially. So it's not that the states are invented and pop out of the blue as magically in the modern age for some obscure, weird random factor. It's the construction of a state has always existed throughout all times in history, and you can argue that in the Middle Ages, yeah, there was a state at all time, and it couldn't be otherwise because it's how societies really work. So please do not link the word state automatically to what you think like the modern state. First of all, because the modern state is absolutely similar to the medieval one. The real watershed is the contemporary state, the nation state, the state as unique source of right, for instance, of law. Essentially, even the modern state functions in the same exact way the modern one does, the medieval one does, except it's in the forms, in the administrative forms, is more centralized. But in the Ancien regime, legal legitimation is exactly the same. It works by delegation of the local powers. Yeah, of course, these monarchies began to stress to impose the fact that were chosen by God. There was some extra authority coming from, but aside from some minor exceptions, this actually never became standard. As a, it was never enough as the as a justification and as legitimacy for the local power to exist as such, and it was always this, and this had been created mostly to the feudal times as a widespread practice that was practically at the base of, in fact, the Ancien regime as an eminently feudal system. So you can argue that in this sense, the state, the secular powers emerged from a extremely complicated struggle. It wasn't really something easy to do because it entailed a constant bargaining with the local communities. It's something that took centuries and centuries before arriving to the contemporary state. While the church, in this sense, had a much easier life, because from one side because the church was essentially waiving these privileges of exemption that were originally owed to the church. The idea that also in here had never been settled, that the church was something into which the state could not put its hand on. And this is wrong, although it is how it was practically being built up ideally in the West by the same Roman Church. I mean, the idea that the church had always had its own private domain, that nobody could touch it, and the state was the true Christian state. The true Christian emperors would never dare ask to mind the ecclesiastical business. Too bad that actually it wasn't like that, because if you see, the Byzantines had evolved it in a quite different way, and actually, but the ambiguity, whichever side you wanna, in Constantinople, the emperor was at the head of the church. So there was even in Constantinople a time in which the church tried kind of to stress its own prerogatives, but they were raised, they were stamped, and they failed. But in the West, it was all the other way around, because the political fragmentation had brought this an immense growth of the papal prerogatives, that the emperors, in order to see their authority validated, tended to grant as a privilege. So even paying with these areas of these regions, like we have seen with the Romagna, there it was sold by the Habsburgs to the papacy, that because in exchange for the recognition of also of their siding with the church. And the while and this was very important because the properties of the church naturally were huge. Mm-hmm. And every single place in Europe had ecclesiastical lands, were also pretty developed, usually also very well administered. So and at this time we're sending lots of resources to Rome through the strengthening of the definitely of the papal administration and bureaucracy at this time, and that pushed towards its centralization. And this was a problem because there were lots of resources that were exiting the local environment, let's say, and going to Rome. And the national monarchies sometimes began to say, okay, but we want our money for ourselves. So these all the clashes that occurred, I don't know, between Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII, and lots of it happened at so many levels in so many different ways now, but it was a structural problem indeed. But the point in here is that everybody could find kind of an ally, because naturally the national monarchies were trying to reinforce their temporal power by imposing a sort of economical and tax weight over the communities, by saying, okay, we have to, if you want to be defended, you necessarily have to pay, at least for our army. And this was always a continuous effort, a continuous negotiations, because the naturally there were more or less consentient communities, but nobody actually really wanted to pay that much. So the greatest accomplishment of the modern state was to kind of settle an order into which the state kind of granted something in exchange of something else, in order to build a self-standing army and to have the even the armed force from its own side. It's something more readily available. At this time there weren't really things like permanent armies yet, although actually the very first core of it is conceived in 1356 with the part of the French army. But anyhow, the problem was most of all a matter of money, not even of strictly permanence of certain troops. It's really like you can have certain permanent forces, I don't know, certain guards, certain garrisons, but an army is a whole different thing. I mean, thousands of men, etc. And this had a cost. So naturally, even the same communities sometimes were saying, I don't know, let's side with the church because we don't really want to pay money to our lords, and let's play it sneakily. However, this is how you can imagine. Really, medieval times were so complicated in so many ways, and the what I don't think I have to add anything. I think we didn't really talk much about warfare after all, but sometimes you have necessarily to consider these strictly pragmatical and administrative and organizational problems of war, and that are all one with politics, because indeed you can't understand how an army was mobilized at the time if you don't understand who paid for it, who went into it, who was using it, and what for. So we touched many topics now, but I hope that the essentials were kind of clear for all of them, and for now. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Goodbye.